and welcome back to Ed Closet On Demand, the place to be for arts integration and STEAM professional development. My name is Susan Riley. I'm your host. I'm also the founder of EducationCloset.com, and today is the final piece in a three-part puzzle about moving from strategies to lessons in any grade level. So in our previous two videos, we talked about how to find strategies, first of all, that are guaranteed winners. And my favorite tip of all time is to take a look at Pinterest and look for strategies that other educators are using outside of your genre. Which means that if you're an arts educator, you start following some classroom educators to get some ideas of what they're pinning and what strategies they're using. And if you're a classroom educator, you're following some arts educators to see what they're doing and how you can make those strategies work in your classroom. Because if the strategy works in one, most likely it's going to be able to work in another with a few small tweaks. In video 2, we talked about how to take those strategies that you found and crafted to work for your classroom and extend them across grade levels. So lots of times people struggle with this strategy is great, but I really think it's an elementary strategy. Do you have something for me at a different level? And it's the great thing about strategy is that it doesn't have to do that. Strategies will correlate across grade levels depending on how you want to use them and making sure that you're still staying authentic to the process. So for today's segment, we're actually going to be taking a look at now, how do you take those strategies and really go through the lesson planning process so that it's not just a one and done strategy session, but instead it's really meaningful to the lesson practice and students are really getting hands-on experience using the arts within their content areas. So here's how we do this. If we're going to take the example that we used last time of the improvisation frame, you would actually start by taking a look at the standards that are being addressed by the strategy. So for instance, if I'm using the improvisation frame, I would be taking a look at perhaps using rhythms and understanding how to combine those rhythms into a piece of music. If I were taking a look at that strategy at the K2 level, I might just be looking at musical expression, students being able to identify loud, soft, short, long, being able to identify the basics of music. And if I'm looking at the high school level, I'm having students take a look at how to use all of the tools in their toolbox and put them together into a composition. So I'm really focused on what are the standards being addressed by the strategy that I'm using, both in my arts area and in my content area that I have matched. So once I find the standard for the strategy that I'm using, I'm going to take a look for parallel standards in the content area that I'd like to use the strategy in. So that we're really focused on aligning those standards. And sometimes standards don't align. Sometimes an arts integration strategy is meant as a way to get students artfully thinking, but not necessarily as a prompt into the lesson. So unless that strategy is going to be connected to a lesson content standard, then it's not going to be arts integration. I say that all the time. Probably the people who follow Ed Closet on a daily basis get tired of me saying that, but it's really true. And we always have to keep that in our mind so that it's true integration and not enhancement. Now, once you find those parallel standards and you have aligned them, then you want to take a look at how am I going to use that strategy as a propeller into my lesson content and flow. So I'm going to give you a practical example of this because it sounds really nice, right? But how does that actually work? If I take a look at that improvisation frame, and by the way, if you have not watched video 2 of this series, I highly encourage you to go back to that because I go over how to use the improvisation frame strategy. If I were to look at grades 6 through 8 and take a look at that improvisation frame and how we're adding syncopated rhythms to that and exploring different ways that we could use those syncopated rhythms. Perhaps side 1 is using their feet. Perhaps side 2 is using a syncopated rhythm using straws that they got from the cafeteria. I don't know, but how do we make those sounds different? And then I'd actually have students listen to a reading of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. That is a text that many students do right around grade 6. And so if it is also a very complex text to try and go through. It's lengthy, the wording, vocabulary is very challenging, so lots of students struggle with that particular poem. So if I go through that piece and have them listen to it, in the context of their improvisation frame, we could create sounds in their improvisation frame that represent key moments within the poem. And not only that, but take a look at the story arc based upon the musical elements that I'm adding in that improvisation frame. So I'm using the improvisation frame as a propeller to understanding the plot development and the arc to the climax of the piece, which is a challenging piece for my students. And then I can have my students not only identify those key pieces and where the climax happens, but also create something that is representative of the story arc. So that is one way that we could take a look at designing a lesson that truly captures those pieces together. Not only would I then frame that within the Paul Revere piece, but then I'd move into having them craft their own story using that same arc that they just went through with Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. Finally, you're going to ask yourself, how am I going to assess this lesson? And in something like that, I would be taking a look at, are students performing syncopated rhythms? Sometimes they're not. Can students creatively use rhythms and non-traditional instruments to create a composition that has a beginning, a middle, and a climax and an end? That makes sense. And then I would also be looking at a similar assessment for the writing piece. So my students are actually creating a composition both musically and with written language. So that is one way that you can take a strategy and move it into a lesson, but you'll notice that it is much more in depth in lesson practice than it is just as a strategy alone. It's important in this whole process that you prepare your students well. One of the things we talk about all the time is the time we're spending preparing, presenting, and performing with an arts integrated lesson. That's coming up next week. I'm going to be going through that P3 principle with you. But keep that in mind because we want to prepare our students well so that when we get to the lesson content, they're really ready for it and are able to kind of explode into that presentation piece and make sense out of their learning. All right, if you have had a great learning experience in this 3-video series, I highly encourage you to check out the Learning Studios. We are closing enrollment for that on April 30th, and it will not open again until October. We have tons of video content in there just like this series. We have over 15 hours of videos that are filled with helpful tips and strategies and things that you can really take and put into your classroom right away. We also have 6 online classes in there that you can take at your own pace. Truly, we've had people go in, register, enroll for the Learning Studios and not touch those online classes until the summer when they have time, and it's completely fine. Nobody is on you to get it done. It's truly self-paced learning on your terms, and if you would like to take it for graduate credit, you may. So each of those courses is worth between 2 and 3 graduate credits from our HLC accredited partner, Adams State University. And what's even better is that you get access to our online conferences, both in the summer and in the winter, for free as a member of the Learning Studios. So if you're serious about arts integration and STEAM, if you want to learn more, if it's something that is meaningful to you in your practice, then I highly encourage checking out the Learning Studios. The web address is down at the bottom. It's classes.educationcloset.com/overview. You'll find all the details. But remember that this does close on April 30th. And if you miss enrollment, I can't reopen it for you. We get questions about that all the time and have a waiting list in the thousands to be able to get in when enrollment opens. So there is no limitation to enrollment, but except for the time. So be sure to check that out. In the meantime, I will be back here with you next week to go over that P3 principle. My name is Susan Riley, your host at Ed Closet On Demand. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you next week.